All right, get ready. Because today we're going to really dig into narcissism. And we're going to be looking at this really interesting research article from way back in 1987. It's packed with surprises, trust me.
1987, huh? That's like right in the middle of that whole Mead generation thing. Be interesting to see how a researcher looked at narcissism back then when it was such a big topic, you know?
Totally, yeah. The article's called Narcissism, Theory and Measurement. It's by Robert A. Emmons, and it's from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. But I'm curious, before we really get into it, did all that me generation stuff have any impact on the research?
Well, that's one of the first things Emmons talks about. He's really careful to keep narcissism, like the actual personality trait, separate from all the cultural stuff going on at the time.
Yeah.
He makes it clear that he's looking at how narcissism shows up in individuals, like regardless of what's happening in society.
Right, that makes sense. So how do you even start to measure something as complex as narcissism? I mean, do you just ask people, hey, are you full of yourself or what?
Huh, that'd be funny. But not very scientific. Emmons used a tool called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, or NPI. It's a questionnaire, basically. It's designed to measure different parts of narcissism, not to actually diagnose it as a disorder or anything.
Okay, so it's more like a personality assessment, not a clinical tool.
What?
But wait a minute. Doesn't everyone have some level of narcissism?
Yeah.
Where do you draw the line?
That's a great question, and it gets to what makes this research so insightful. See, the NPI doesn't just give you one score. It breaks narcissism down into 4 different factors.
4 factors. Okay, now I'm really interested. Tell me more.
So we got leadership authority,
Mhm.
self-absorption, self-admiration, superiority arrogance, and then lastly, exploitiveness entitlement.
Exploitiveness entitlement. Whoa, that one sounds kind of intense.
Yeah. And that's where things get really interesting. Emmons found that that specific factor, exploitiveness entitlement, is the one that's most closely tied to what we think of as problematic narcissism, the kind that can really mess up relationships and well-being.
So even though we're talking about narcissism as this big thing, it's not just one size fits all. There are these different flavors of it. And some might be more concerning than others.
Exactly. And what's even crazier is that these factors don't always go together. Like, you could be high on leadership authority, but low on exploitiveness entitlement. It really shows how nuanced narcissism is.
Okay, you've definitely got me hooked. What other surprising things did Emmons find out about narcissism? I'm ready for more.
Well, one thing really challenges what we usually think about narcissists. We usually picture them as super confident, right? But Emmons found that some aspects of narcissism are actually linked to bigger mood swings and more intense emotions in general.
Wait, really? I always thought narcissists were all about just feeling good about themselves. All the time?
Not necessarily. Think about it this way. If how you feel about yourself depends a lot on what other people think, wouldn't that make you more sensitive to the ups and downs of life? Like, even a small criticism could really get to you.
That's a good point. So it's not just about feeling good, it's about how intense those feelings are and how much they change.
Exactly. And Emmons connected this to something called self-complexity. Basically, the idea is that people who see themselves in a lot of different roles, like as a parent, a friend, at their job, and so on, they tend to experience less extreme emotions. It's like having multiple shock absorbers in your life.
I like that analogy. If you're not putting all your emotional eggs in one basket, you're less likely to be totally wrecked if one thing goes wrong.
Exactly. And that's where the link to narcissism comes in. If someone has a less complex sense of self, maybe they're too focused on one role or achievement, their emotional well-being becomes a lot more fragile.
Wow, this is making me think about my own emotional patterns in a new way.
Yeah.
I got to admit, I'm kind of fascinated by this self-complexity idea now.
It's definitely something to think about. And there's even more to uncover about how narcissism affects our thinking. Emmons found a connection to attribution theory, which is all about how we explain why things happen in our lives.
Attribution theory. Okay, I might need some help with that one. Sounds a little academic.
It's actually pretty simple. Think about this. When something good happens, do you usually take credit for it? And when something bad happens, do you try to blame it on something else? That's attribution theory in action.
Ah, I see. So I nailed that presentation because I'm awesome versus I bombed that test because the teacher was terrible.
Exactly. Most people have what's called a self-serving bias, meaning we tend to say our successes are because of us and our failures are because of something else. It's a natural way to protect our egos.
Makes sense. But how does this relate to narcissism?
Well, Emmons suggests that narcissism might make this self-serving bias even stronger, like taking it to a whole new level.
So someone high in narcissism might be even more likely to take credit for the good stuff and avoid blame for the bad stuff.
Exactly. It's all about maintaining that inflated sense of self, even if it means bending reality a bit. And remember those different factors of narcissism we talked about? Well, Emmons thought that some factors might play a specific role in this whole attribution process.
Okay, now my brain is really working. We've only scratched the surface of this article, and I'm already seeing narcissism in a whole new light. I can't wait to dig into how those different factors affect how we see things and how we act.
Me too. This is where we really start to see how these abstract ideas play out in real life.
What?
So let's get into some of the details of Emmons's research. You mentioned you were curious about the four factors of narcissism and how they might play out differently.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially after you said how some of them might be tied to that self-serving bias thing.
Right, right. Well, Emmons did this study where he wanted to see how the NPI, the narcissistic personality inventory, measured up against some other ways of measuring narcissism. So he used three other scales. Each one kind of looked at narcissism a bit differently.
Okay, so we're going even deeper into how narcissism is measured. I'm following along.
Good, good. He used this thing called the MCMI, which stands for Millen Clinical Multiaxial Inventory. Don't worry too much about the name. And then the NPDS, which is the Narcissistic Personality Disorder Scale. Those two are used to identify more serious types of narcissism, the kind that could lead to, like, a clinical diagnosis.
I see. So those are focusing on the more extreme end of things.
Yeah.
What was the third scale?
The third one was called the selfism scale. And this one's interesting because it looks at what you might call like everyday narcissism. It's not so much about harmful behaviors. It's more about how self-centered someone's thinking is.
Okay, so we've got these different scales, each kind of looking at a different angle of narcissism. What happened when Emmons compared them to the NTI?
Well, get this. The total NPI score, meaning you add up all four factors, that score actually correlated most strongly with the selfism scale.
Oh, really? So even though the MPI measures those four different things, it still seems to be picking up on this overall tendency to be, well, kind of self-centered.
Exactly. But here's the twist. When Emmons looked at each individual MPI subscale, the one that correlated most strongly with the MCMI and NPDS, those scales that measure more pathological narcissism, was exploitiveness entitlement.
Ah, that makes sense. Like we were saying, that factor seems to be the one that can make narcissism really problematic.
Right. Emmons points this out over and over in his research. Exploitiveness entitlement. That's the factor that's linked to bad relationships, lack of empathy, even the potential to hurt others. It's the one to really watch out for.
Okay, so we're seeing how these different signs of narcissism can show up in really different ways. Some might be pretty harmless, while others are more worrisome. But Emmons didn't just stop at measuring narcissism, right? He also looked at how it's connected to our emotions, didn't he?
Yep, you got it. He wanted to know how narcissism affects how people experience their emotions and how they control them.
Which brings us back to that whole self-complexity idea, right?
Yeah.
Where people who have a more diverse sense of self are better at handling emotional ups and downs.
Exactly. Emmons thought that people with a less complex sense of self, maybe they're too focused on just one role or achievement, they might be more prone to having really intense moods, and moods that change a lot.
Like their whole self-worth is riding on that one thing. So
Yeah.
any setback in that area would feel like a total disaster.
That's a good way to put it. To test this, Emmons did something really impressive. He had a group of people keep track of their moods in detail for 42 days straight.
Wow, 42 days. That's dedication.
I know, right? And what he found was amazing. The total NPI score, the overall narcissism measure, was correlated with more variability in both good moods and bad moods.
So more narcissistic people, no matter which specific factors they scored high on, they tended to have more dramatic shifts in their mood from day to day.
Exactly. But when he looked at the individual subscales, two of them stood out as being especially linked to mood variability. Exploitiveness, entitlement, and no surprise there. And, this might surprise you, self-absorption, self-admiration.
Wait, self-admiration leads to mood swings. I thought that would make someone feel more consistently good about themselves, not more up and down.
It does seem counterintuitive, but think about it. If you're super focused on yourself and your own needs, any little rejection or perceived slight from others could be a big hit to your ego.
It's like their emotional well-being depends entirely on how other people see them. No wonder they'd be on an emotional roller coaster.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to have a more balanced sense of self, one that isn't so dependent on what other people think.
This whole self-complexity thing is really sticking with me. Makes you wonder if there are ways to actually build a more complex sense of self, almost like building up resistance to those emotional swings.
That's a great question, and it's definitely something Emmons' research points towards. If we can understand how different parts of narcissism affect our emotions, maybe we can find ways to help people have more stable emotions.
Wow, my mind is blown. We've covered so much. And I'm seeing narcissism in a totally different way now. But we haven't gotten to that connection with attribution theory yet, have we? That idea that narcissism could warp how we see why things happen.
You're right. We still need to unpack that. That's where we get into the really interesting stuff
Yeah.
about how narcissism shapes our thinking and how we understand the world.
Okay, so let's circle back to that narcissism and attribution theory connection.
Yeah.
It's like the brain twister part of this whole deep dive.
Yeah, definitely a cool area to explore. Remember, attribution theory is all about how we explain why things happen, the good stuff and the bad stuff. And as we talked about, most people have that self-serving bias thing going on.
Right, that thing where we take all the credit when things are good and blame everyone else when things go wrong, like a built-in ego protector.
Exactly. And what Emmons found is that narcissism could actually, magnify that bias.
So it's like narcissism could make us see things in a distorted way. Like we might not be able to admit when we messed up or take responsibility for our mistakes.
That's what it seems like, yeah. And it's not just about avoiding blame either. Think about those 4 factors of narcissism again. Emmons had this idea that the leadership authority factor might also play a part in how we explain things.
I wouldn't have thought to connect those two. How so?
Well, think about the traits that go with leadership authority. Wanting to be seen as competent, being in control, a natural leader. So when things go right for these people, they might be even more likely to say it's because of their own skills in leadership.
So it's not just about protecting their ego. It's about making themselves look even better. Like they're super capable and deserve all the praise.
Exactly. It feeds into that story they have about themselves, the amazing leader who can't do any wrong.
Gotcha. It's all making sense now. The self-serving bias is like the starting point, and then these different aspects of narcissism add their own little twist to it.
That's a great way to think about it, and this brings up a really important question. If narcissism can really mess with how we see things and explain them, what does that mean for our relationships with other people?
Yeah, I can imagine it causing a lot of problems. If someone's always taking the credit and never the blame, that doesn't sound like a recipe for healthy relationships.
You're right, and think about what it does to empathy. If you're too busy worrying about your own image, it's harder to really understand and connect with other people's perspectives.
This is getting pretty heavy. Is there anything we can do about it? Like, can we, I don't know, undistort our perceptions
Yeah.
and become more aware of our own biases?
That's the big question, isn't it? Emmons doesn't really give us any easy answers, but he says the most important thing is awareness. Just knowing that these biases exist is a huge first step.
And maybe that's where learning about these different parts of narcissism comes in, is like giving us a new way to understand these patterns in ourselves and other people.
Absolutely. By understanding the different ways narcissism shows up, we can start to notice when our own biases are sneaking in, or when someone else's narcissism is affecting how we interact with them. It's all about developing a more, I guess you could say, understanding view of human behavior.
I like that, an understanding view. Because in the end, we're all prone to these biases, right? Narcissism isn't this black and white thing. It's a spectrum, and we all fall somewhere on it.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so important. It's not about calling people out and labeling them as narcissists. It's about recognizing that narcissism, in all its forms, is just part of being human. And understanding it can help us navigate relationships and even our own inner world with more awareness and kindness.
So what's the takeaway for you, dear listener? I think the big thing is that narcissism is way more complex than we usually think. It's not just about being vain and self-obsessed. It's about leadership, self-admiration, feeling superior. And yeah, sometimes it's even about taking advantage of others.
And even more than that, Emmons' research shows how these different sides of narcissism can affect our emotions, our relationships, and even how we see the world.
Here's something to think about. Could learning about these different parts of narcissism help us understand and manage our own emotions and behaviors better, even if we don't score high on that NPI test?
That's a good question to ask yourself. You could even try taking the NPI yourself, just for fun. Remember, it's just for information, not for diagnosing yourself. The real journey is about becoming more self-aware and understanding how these tendencies show up in your own life.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of narcissism. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those questions coming.